Reaganomics, also known as the Reagan Revolution. The heart of Reaganomics and this so-called 1980s revolution was the ERTA. This is the Economic Recovery and Tax Act of 1981. It basically reduced personal income tax rates by about 25% over 3 years. Now, the idea behind this was slash personal income tax rates, and therefore people will spend more money. And in this way, it will stimulate business activity because it's lowering taxes overall, though it also, in particular, slashed rates for the rich. The other thing about this, though, is if you're slashing tax rates, you're also cutting government income. With less money basically coming into like federal programs and more hands in the money of consumers, the idea was investors will stimulate economic growth. But you also have to keep in mind how that's going to affect your government, because things like defense spending and Social Security were basically untouchable. They're not going to cut revenue going into those kinds of programs. But what this really means is they can't do any kind of new program without cutting old ones. So we're going to see cuts to things like mass transit, school lunches, and similar programs. Now, that being said, these kinds of programs like school lunches and stuff could be done at like the state level or the local level, just not at the federal level. The second part of the Reaganomics is going to be deregulation. Deregulation starts in the 70s. In fact, you get first like the deregulation of air travel, which would allow air carriers to like start and stop service at will, which means that you get kind of like cheaper and more frequent air service to major hubs, but poorer and more expensive service for smaller cities and such. But we're going to see a lot of the deregulation is aimed at the environment and banking. So basically we see at this time period, the Republican Party attaches like all of this environmental legislation, like the EPA and everything like that, as strangling the economy by regulation. So we're going to get Reagan's administration is going to slice funding for the EPA. Also, there were these vast amount of like federal land holdings out in the West, and they're going to transfer a lot of these lands to the states because a lot of times the states had less environmental protections, and therefore they could use the land for more rapid economic use. So federal government agencies actually sell like different areas to like timber companies, even at a loss, just trying to bring it back and kind of revive the economy a little bit more. And they're going to expand like offshore oil drilling and expedite exploration for like minerals. And then we also get banking deregulation. So the 80s is going to really transform a lot of American financial markets. We're going to get all of these new like savings and loans that are being established, and they're all trying to compete for people's deposits. And then they would reinvest their money in basically much riskier like commercial real estate, which will eventually lead to a financial crisis when you have a lot of these bad loans end up destroying hundreds of savings and loans in the 90s. So it's going to lead to economic issues, but not when Reagan's in office. In the end, in the 90s, taxpayers are going to be left to like bail out a lot of these depositors to prevent the collapse of the United States like financial and credit system. We're also going to see with this deregulation of like industries during this time period and financial markets, we get a lot of corporate consolidations and mergers flourishing. So it's getting closer to having something like oligopolies and stuff like that. It's not to that extent, but it's getting close to that, and that means there's less competition, so to speak. Now, in the short term, all of these things are going to help the national economy boom. It's actually going to bring about like nearly 2 million new jobs. Inflation dips to about 3% per year, and you want inflation to occur, you just want wages to keep pace with inflation. And so the fact that we're going to see, unemployment rates coming down eventually, like, this is helping people. And the stock market, you're seeing an overall prosperity. Therefore, so far, looking at all of this and other videos and everything, what would you say is the best thing about Reagan or the 80s in general, and what is the worst thing? And feel free to wait on this question, watch a couple more videos before answering it. Because there's one other part of Reaganomics that's really, really important, and this is dealing with organized labor. So what we see is another round of the Republican Party going against labor unions. Ronald Reagan is going to fire more than 11,000 members of a professional air traffic controllers organization for violating a no-strike clause in their hiring agreements. And this sends like this message basically to organized labor that he isn't necessarily going to back them up the same way. Large companies at this point wouldn't hesitate in hiring like permanent replacements for striking workers, which of course undercuts strikes. So we're going to see a decline in union membership as well as blue-collar jobs during this time period. In fact, even though the number of employed Americans doubles during this time period, the number of union members declines all the same. Unions are going to struggle to cope with the changing economy, and corporations seize on this opportunity. So really, when you're looking at the 70s and 80s, a lot of workers faced all kinds of new threats from their employers, like an employer might move their factory to a new site in the United States or overseas, and unless they can move, across America, like, that's going to be problematic for a lot of people. A lot of times you get corporations like selling out to a new owner who sometimes would close the plant and then reopen without having that union contract in place. And then you're just seeing an overall decline of blue-collar jobs. In fact, we're seeing this impact of this economic restructuring even in like popular culture with like TV programs like Roseanne, where you're seeing like families struggle to raise a family on an income from like a series of jobs, and people are no longer having that lifelong unionized factory job. That's a thing of the past now. Now it's, one day they might be working, or for a few weeks they're working as an assembly line worker, then a waitress, then a skilled laborer, etc., etc. The thing is, with changing jobs pretty regularly, it's a lot harder to accumulate like savings and stay ahead of any kind of financial crisis that goes on in normal life. Oh, your car breaks down, you have to buy a new carburetor, etc. for it. You have to have saved in those cases, and constantly changing jobs makes it harder to save. It makes it harder to pay to send your kids to college. And so we see things like an increase in personal bankruptcy filings. A lot of companies are replacing blue-collar workers with machinery. So we're seeing that mechanization that's really problematic in taking away a lot of jobs that people had been working their entire lives. Or a lot of companies shift to like non-union plants. And then the corporate merger mania of the 80s means that actually when you're looking at manufacturing employment, it declines by about 2 million jobs during the 80s.